What happens when someone decides the rules don't apply to them, but the crowd decides they do? Is dignity a privilege or a shared expectation? This isn't just a story about a woman with a cart. It's about the fragile architecture of social order and what breaks when one person refuses to wait. It began in the most ordinary place, a grocery store queue humming with quiet tension, the kind of space where civility is measured not by words but by patience. I stood there, behind a man with 2 items, ahead of a woman with a basket, surrounded by the soft shuffle of feet and the occasional sigh of someone recalculating their evening. And then she arrived. Karen, not her real name, but the archetype fit too well to ignore. She didn't walk in, she entered, with a cart full of groceries and a presence that demanded attention. Her eyes scanned the line not with curiosity, but with calculation. And then, without hesitation, she pushed her cart forward, past a man, past me, past the woman behind me, and stopped at the front. No apology, no question, just placement, as if the line were a suggestion, as if her time mattered more. And in that moment, the air changed. Not loudly, not violently, but perceptibly. A ripple of disbelief passed through the queue, subtle but sharp. I felt it in my chest, the tightening of something unspoken, because this wasn't just about groceries. It was about hierarchy, about the illusion of shared rules, about the quiet contract we all sign when we agree to wait. And she broke it, not with malice, with indifference. And indifference is more dangerous than aggression, because it doesn't acknowledge the existence of others. It erases them. I looked around, expecting someone to speak. No one did, because confrontation is uncomfortable, because calling out entitlement feels impolite, because we've been taught that silence is safer than truth, but silence is also complicity. And I felt it rising in me, not anger but clarity, the clarity that comes when someone redraws the map and expects you to follow. I stepped forward, not to fight, but to ask. "Excuse me," I said, "there's a line." She turned slowly with the kind of smile that says, "I know, but I don't care." "I'm in a hurry," she said, and that sentence echoed. "I'm in a hurry," as if urgency were a justification, as if her schedule outweighed our presence, as if the rest of us were obstacles, not participants. I didn't move, neither did she, and the line behind me held its breath, because this was no longer about groceries. It was about power, about who gets to decide what matters, about who gets to rewrite the rules in real time. And I knew this was a moment of disruption, the moment when one step forward becomes a statement, the moment when silence breaks, the moment when the line becomes a boundary, and someone decides to cross it. She said she was in a hurry, and that phrase, so simple, so familiar, became the justification for erasure. I stood there, watching her cart settle into a space it hadn't earned, and I realized urgency is the currency of entitlement. It's the excuse that bypasses empathy, the shield that deflects accountability, the mask that turns selfishness into necessity. But urgency, when weaponized, is not neutral. It's aggressive. It's invasive. It's the quiet violence of someone who believes their time matters more than yours. And I thought, how many times have we surrendered our place to someone who claimed to be late? How many times have we stepped aside for someone who never asked, only declared? How many times have we mistaken politeness for permission? Karen didn't plead. She didn't negotiate. She announced. And that announcement carried weight. Not because it was true, but because it was confident. Confidence, in the hands of entitlement, becomes a tool of domination. It silences dissent. It reframes intrusion as urgency. It turns the line into a hierarchy. And I saw it happening, not just in the queue, but in the eyes of those around me. Some looked away. Some sighed. Some shifted their weight, recalibrating their patience. Because urgency is contagious. It infects the atmosphere. It makes resistance feel selfish. And I felt it too, the pull to let it go, to avoid conflict, to preserve the fragile piece of public space. But peace built on erasure is not peace. It's submission. And I wasn't willing to submit. I asked her again why she thought her time outweighed ours. She didn't answer. She just gestured her cart, as if volume justified violation. And I thought, this is the anatomy of entitlement. It doesn't argue. It assumes. It doesn't explain. It expects. It doesn't see others. It sees obstacles. Her cart was full, yes, but so was mine. So was the man's ahead of me. So was the woman's behind. Fullness is not a pass. Urgency is not a privilege. And yet, she moved forward, not because she had to, because she could, because she believed no one would stop her. And that belief is the root of entitlement, the quiet confidence that others will yield, that others will absorb the discomfort, that others will carry the weight of her convenience. I didn't yield. I didn't absorb. I didn't carry. I stood, and in that standing, I felt the anatomy of entitlement begin to fracture, not loudly, not visibly, but internally, because when someone expects silence and receives resistance, the illusion begins to crack, and cracks, once formed, don't close easily. They spread, they deepen, they expose. And I knew this wasn't just about a cart. It was about the architecture of urgency, and I was ready to dismantle it. The line didn't move, not because the cashier was slow, but because the moment had frozen. Karen stood at the front, her car a monument to disregard, and the rest of us stood behind her, silent, still, suspended in a collective discomfort. I looked around, searching for eyes that mirrored mine. Some met my gaze briefly, then dropped. Others stared at their phones, at the floor, at anything but the breach. And I realized the crowd wasn't confused. It was conflicted, because civility, when weaponized, becomes complicity. We are taught to be polite, to avoid confrontation, to preserve peace. But what is peace if it's built on erasure? What is politeness if it protects a violator, not the violated? Karen's intrusion wasn't just hers, it was ours, too. Because every second we stayed silent, we endorsed it. Not actively, not loudly, but passively. And passive endorsement is still endorsement. I felt the weight of that truth settle in my chest like a stone. I wanted someone else to speak, to validate my resistance, to make it communal. But no one did, because resistance is uncomfortable, because calling out entitlement feels risky, because we fear escalation more than we fear injustice. And I thought, this is a crowd's dilemma, the tension between discomfort and duty, between peace and principle, between silence and solidarity. Karen didn't need allies. She needed silence. And she got it, not because we agreed, because we hesitated. And hesitation, in moments like this, is surrender. I stepped forward again, not confront, but to ask the crowd, are we okay with this? I said, and the question hung in the air like smoke. No one answered, but the silence was louder than any reply. Because silence, when broken, reveals its weight. A man behind me shifted. A woman cleared her throat. Another person stepped back. And I saw it, the fracture, the moment when the crowd begins to feel its own complicity, not with shame, with recognition. Because recognition is the first step toward resistance. Karen turned, sensing the shift. Her confidence wavered. Not because of me, because of us. Because the crowd, once awakened, is powerful, not violent, not cruel, just present, just unwilling to disappear. And I knew this was a turning point, not the confrontation, the collective realization that civility, when it protects entitlement, is not virtue, it's failure. And we were done failing. The moment didn't explode, it unfolded, like a slow tide pulling back to reveal what had always been buried beneath the surface. Karen turned toward me, her expression shifting from indifference to irritation, the kind that simmers just below the surface of entitlement. Why are you making this a thing? She asked. And that question, so casual, so dismissive, was the spark. Because when someone violates a boundary and then questions your reaction, they're not confused. They're deflecting. They're reframing the narrative so that your resistance becomes the problem. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't step closer. I simply said, because it is a thing. And in that moment, I wasn't just speaking to her. I was speaking to everyone who had ever been erased by convenience. Her eyes narrowed. She gestured to the cashier, who looked frozen, unsure whether to intervene or disappear. And I thought, how many systems teach us to avoid conflict rather than resolve it? How many institutions prioritize speed over fairness, silence over truth? Karen's cart was a symbol now, not of groceries, but of disregard, of the belief that rules bend for those who push hard enough. I asked her again, "Why do you think you belong here?" She scoffed, "I'm just trying to get home." And I said, "So are we." That sentence hung in the air like a challenge, because it was. Because it forced her to confront the reality she had ignored, that her urgency wasn't unique, that her time wasn't more valuable, that her presence didn't override ours. She looked around, searching for allies, but the crowd had shifted. Eyes met mine. Nods followed. A murmur of agreement rippled through the line. And I saw it, the moment when truth refuses to stay quiet, when silence becomes solidarity, when discomfort becomes action. Karen stepped back, slightly, not enough to leave, just enough to acknowledge resistance. But acknowledgement isn't accountability. And I wasn't done. "You don't get to decide," I said. "We do." The cashier cleared her throat. Finally, "Ma'am, you'll need to wait your turn." And that sentence, so simple, so overdue, was a rupture. Karen's face flushed. Her lips tightened. She muttered something about being disrespected. But respect isn't owed, it's earned. And she hadn't earned it. She had demanded it. And demand without regard is not strength, it's weakness. She backed away, slowly, her cart retreating like a defeated army. And the line moved forward, not just physically, philosophically, emotionally, collectively. Because confrontation, when rooted in truth, doesn't divide, it clarifies, it reveals, it restores. And I knew this wasn't just a victory. It was a reckoning, a moment when truth refused to stay quiet. And the crowd finally listened. The line moved again, slowly, like a wound beginning close. Karen had retreated, but the echo of her intrusion lingered, not in anger, in awareness. I stood there, groceries in hand, but my mind was elsewhere, tracing the contours of what had just happened, because this wasn't just about her. It was about us, about the invisible architecture of public life, about the rules we follow not because they're written, but because they're shared. The queue is a ritual, a quiet agreement, a symbol of mutual respect. And when someone breaks it, they don't just step ahead, they step outside the social contract. Karen's cart was a breach, yes, but it was also a mirror, reflecting the fragility of our civility, the ease with which it can be disrupted, the discomfort we feel when asked to defend it. I thought about the man ahead of me, who didn't speak, the woman behind me, who looked away, the cashier, frozen between policy and passivity. And I wondered, what does it take to protect the line? Not just physically, philosophically, emotionally. What does it mean to say, this matters, when others are willing to let it slide? Because letting it slide is easier, it's quieter, it's safer. But safety without integrity is hollow. And I didn't want hollow. I wanted truth. I wanted the kind of truth that doesn't flinch, that doesn't apologize for existing, that doesn't wait for permission to speak. Karen's retreat wasn't a victory. It was a revelation, a glimpse into the mechanics of entitlement, a reminder that silence is not neutrality. It's participation. And I had participated too, once, in other lines, in other moments. I had looked away. I had sighed. I had chosen peace over principle. And I carried that with me, not as guilt, as clarity, because clarity is the beginning of change. The moment when you stop pretending that small violations are harmless. The moment when you realize that every breach is a test of your values, of your courage, of your willingness to be uncomfortable. The line revealed more than Karen's entitlement. It revealed our thresholds, our limits, our fears, and our potential. Because when one person stands, others can follow. Not always, not immediately, but eventually. And that's enough. That's how change begins. Not with noise, with presence, with the quiet, unwavering decision to say, this matters. And I knew I would never see a line the same way again. The confrontation had passed, But the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was residue, a kind of institutional quiet that doesn't soothe, but suppresses. I watched the cashier resume scanning items, her eyes avoiding mine, her voice flat, rehearsed. And I realized she wasn't indifferent. She was conditioned to avoid escalation, conditioned to prioritize flow over fairness, conditioned to believe that speaking up might cost her more than staying quiet. And that conditioning isn't personal, it's systemic. It's built into the architecture of service, into the policies that say the customer is always right, even when they're wrong, into the training manuals that teach de-escalation, not confrontation, into the culture that values speed over dignity. Karen didn't just rely on her own entitlement. She relied on the system's silence. She knew no one would stop her, not because they agreed, because they were taught not to interfere. And I thought, how many institutions have normalized disrespect by refusing to name it? How many workplaces teach their employees to absorb abuse as part of the job? How many systems reward passivity and punish principle? The cashier wasn't the villain. She was a symptom, a reflection of a structure that prioritizes transaction over truth. And I saw it everywhere, in the way the manager never appeared, in the way no policy was cited, in the way the line resumed as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, a breach, a violation, a moment of erasure that was almost endorsed by silence. And I couldn't let that go, not because I wanted conflict, because I wanted accountability. I asked the cashier gently, "Is there a policy about line cutting?" She hesitated. "We're not supposed to get involved," she said. And that sentence, so simple, so damning, was the system speaking, not through cruelty, through avoidance, through the quiet refusal to name what's wrong. And I thought, this is how disrespect becomes routine, not through loud violations, through quiet endorsements, through the absence of resistance, through the normalization of discomfort. Karen didn't need to be powerful. She just needed the system to stay quiet. And it did, until we didn't, until the crowd shifted, until the silence cracked. But the system remained, unchanged, unmoved, unwilling. And I knew, if we wanted change, we couldn't just confront individuals. We had to confront structures. We had to ask harder questions. We had to demand better answers. Because dignity shouldn't depend on who's watching. It should be built into the foundation, into the training, into the culture, into the expectation. And I wasn't just resisting Karen anymore. I was resisting the silence that made her possible, the silence that made her confident, the silence that made her untouchable, until we spoke. Karen didn't just cut the line. She cut into a cultural wound. Her cart wasn't just full of groceries. It was full of assumptions. Assumptions about who gets to go first, about who gets to bend the rules, about who gets to be seen and who gets to be ignored. And I realized she wasn't just a person. She was a symbol, a mirror held up to society that quietly rewards confidence over consideration, that teaches some people they're the exception, while others are taught to wait. Her gesture wasn't isolated. It was inherited from a culture that equates urgency with importance, that confuses dominance with leadership, that mistakes silence for agreement. Karen's entitlement didn't begin in the store. It began in 1,000 moments before it, in systems that told her she mattered more, in interactions where she was never challenged, in spaces where her comfort was prioritized over others' dignity. And I thought, how many Karens are out there, not just in grocery stores, but in boardrooms, classrooms, neighborhoods? How many people have learned that rules are flexible if you're confident enough, that boundaries are negotiable if you're persuasive enough, that consequences are optional if you're loud enough? Her cart was a metaphor for privilege, for unchecked power, for the quiet erosion of shared norms. And the line was a stage, a place where the performance of entitlement met the resistance of reality. I didn't confront Karen because of her groceries. I confronted her because of what she represented, a cultural script that says, take what you want and let others adjust. And I refused to adjust, not because I wanted conflict, because I wanted clarity, because I wanted to challenge the script, to rewrite it, to say, no, you don't get to decide. Karen's retreat wasn't just personal. It was symbolic, a crack in the illusion, a moment when the mirror shattered. And I saw it in the crowd, in the way people stood taller, spoke louder, looked each other in the eye. Because when a symbol breaks, it frees the space it occupied. It creates room for new stories, for new norms, for new expectations. Karen wasn't a villain. She was a reflection. And reflections, once recognized, can be changed. Not easily, not quickly, but inevitably. Because culture is not static. It's shaped by moments, by resistance, by the refusal to stay quiet. And I knew this wasn't just about a cart. It was about a culture. And we were ready to confront it. The line eventually dissolved. Groceries were bagged. Receipts printed. People left. But the moment stayed. Not in the air, but in the architecture of memory. I walked out of the store with more than food. I carried a shift, a recalibration of what it means to belong in public space. Karen was gone. Her cart, her urgency, her silence. But the echo of her entitlement lingered, not as a threat, as a lesson, because every breach teaches us something, about others, yes, but mostly about ourselves, about our thresholds, our reflexes, our willingness to speak. I thought about the cashier, the crowd, the hesitation. I thought about the systems that teach us to absorb rather than resist. And I thought about the power of one moment, one refusal, one voice. Because resistance doesn't need a megaphone. It needs presence. It needs clarity. It needs someone to say, "This matters," and mean it. I didn't change the world that day, but I changed the room. And rooms, once changed, ripple outward. I saw it in the eyes of the woman behind me, how she stood taller, in the nod of the man ahead, how he lingered, just long enough to say thank you, in the cashier's voice, how it steadied just slightly when the next customer arrived. These are the legacies we leave, not grand gestures, small shifts, quiet recalibrations, moments that say, you're not invisible, you're not alone, you're not wrong for wanting dignity. Karen's cart was a disruption, but our response was a restoration, a reminder that shared space requires shared respect, that rules aren't just guidelines, they're agreements, that civility isn't passive, it's active, it's a choice we make again and again in the face of convenience, urgency, and disregard. I walked to my car, the sun low, the air still, and I felt something settle. Not pride, not victory, just peace. The kind that comes when you know you didn't disappear, when you know you didn't let the moment pass unchallenged, when you know you stood not for confrontation, but for clarity. That's the legacy, not the conflict, the clarity, the refusal to let silence win, the decision to speak, even when it's easier not to. And I knew the next time someone steps ahead, the room will remember, the line will remember, I will remember, and that memory is the beginning of change.